In February of 1272 BCE, approximately, the king of Egypt, Ramesses II, was ensconced in his northern palace. His great residence, called Ramesses, was now more than 20 years old. Its halls echoed with the bustle of court life, and outside, the city was awash with the noise of construction. Great temples, palaces, and domestic quarters still rising after decades. But amidst that clamour, so familiar to the residents, there came something new. One day, a group of foreigners arrived at the palace gates. They were dressed in colourful robes down to their ankles, long black hair and thick beards. Some of them wore helmets and carried shields in a distinctive figure-8 style. These were Hittites, or men of the Hatti land. They came as an embassy. The foreigners brought a special package to the residence of Pharaoh. Drawing it out of a box, they presented it before Ramesses. The item was long expected, and it did not disappoint. The Hittites brought a tablet made of fine quality silver and inscribed with cuneiform writing. It bore the fruits of a carefully cultivated agreement. On this silver tablet lay a treaty. Ramesses II, king of Egypt, and Hattusili III, king of Hatti, had made peace. The Egyptian-Hittite War was coming to an end. In the 21st year of his reign, the pharaoh Wasmuria Satepnaria Riamesesa Mayamana, or Ramesses II, announced his treaty with Hatti. It was not the first such agreement between the two empires, but it is the first to survive into the modern world. This Egyptian-Hittite Treaty is a landmark in the history of diplomacy. In fact, a large-scale replica of the treaty now hangs in the halls of the United Nations building in New York, a symbol of the power, the value, of communication and cooperation. The Egyptian-Hittite Treaty survives in two versions. One comes from Egypt, carved on the walls of Karnak Temple in modern Luxor. The other is a set of clay tablets from the ruins of Hattusa, the Hittite capital city. Today, these tablets are in the Archaeological Museum in Istanbul and the New Museum in Berlin. The Egyptian-Hittite Treaty is remarkably well preserved, to the benefit of historians, and now to you. Anyway, enough introduction. Let's get into the agreements. As you can imagine, the first is the most important. A statement of peace and unity between Ramesses and Hattusili. Combining the Egyptian and Hittite versions, the treaty goes as follows. Quote, "The treaty which the relevant king made upon a silver tablet, commencing good peace and brotherhood between them forever. Formerly, the god did not permit hostilities between Egypt and Hatti by treaty, but in the time of Muwatalli, the great king, he fought against Ramesses, the great king of Egypt. But now, as from today, the two kings make a treaty to establish the relationship that the gods had made, in order to prevent hostility from ever arising again. The kings have established good brotherhood and good peace between us forever, to create good peace and good brotherhood in the relationship of Hatti and Egypt." End quote. As an opening statement, the treaty is loud and clear. Henceforth, Ramesses and Hattusili would put down the swords and become brothers. No more fighting. The gods desired peace. The opening references the conflict that had raged between Ramesses and Muwatalli, who was Hattusili's brother and predecessor. Notably, the treaty presents this war as an aberration, a break in the peace that had existed formerly. This proclamation was partly religious or philosophical, couching the treaty in terms of a divinely mandated agreement. It was also historical. There is evidence for an earlier treaty between Egypt and Hatti, made several decades before. We'll come back to that later. So, agreement number 1, peace and brotherhood. A fine statement, but how to enforce it. The next section confirms the peace in more practical terms. The two kings made a solemn vow of territorial integrity. From Karnak, we have the following, quote, "The great chief of Hatti shall never trespass against the land of Egypt to take anything away from it. Likewise, the great ruler of Egypt shall never trespass against the land of Hatti to take anything from it." End quote. Fairly straightforward. The Karnak version phrases it simply as a promise. The Hattusili version is slightly different because it adds a component of divine guarantee. Quote, "This is the eternal regulation which the sun god and the storm god have made for Egypt with Hatti. It intends peace and brotherhood and to prevent hostilities between them. Egypt will be at peace with Hatti forever." End quote. This promise of territorial security is surprisingly vague on which territories they mean. In a modern treaty, one might expect precise definitions of borders, vassal states, exact lines of demarcation. This treaty does not do that. Maybe those details were agreed verbally rather than writing, or maybe the respective territories were taken for granted. Everyone knew this town and region belongs to Egypt, but that town and region belongs to Hatti. Perhaps there was no need to be too precise. But it is curious that, given they are promising to respect one another's lands, they don't specify which lands they were. It's just a different mindset generally. Now, the treaty does something that is extremely Hittite. It includes a short retrospective of previous agreements and relations. This kind of clause appears in many Hittite treaties, a way of setting the scene and preparing the terms. From Karnak, we get the following, quote, "As for the existing treaty that had been current in the time of Suppiluliuma, the great ruler of Hatti, and likewise the standing treaty that had existed in the time of Muwatalli, the great ruler of Hatti, I, Hattusili, hold firm to it. Behold, Ramesses also holds firm to it, to the treaty or peace that he has made. We both hold firm to it. We shall remain within this consistent relationship." End quote. Hattusili mentions earlier treaties, but his phrasing here is terribly vague. Was the Hittite saying that there was one treaty made by Suppiluliuma and a second treaty made by Muwatalli? Or was he saying that there was one treaty made by Suppiluliuma that remained in effect until the reign of Muwatalli? This may seem a minor difference, but it has caused great debate among specialists for both cultures. Today, I'm following the Hittitologist Dietrich Surenhagen and the Egyptologist Peter Brand. These two scholars make strong arguments, based on context, grammar, and syntax, that there was just one treaty. It had come about in the time of Suppiluliuma in the mid-1300s, and it lasted until the reign of Muwatalli, at which point hostilities broke out. Chronologically, that's still frustrating, because Muwatalli had a long reign, and his rule overlapped with Ramesses II, his father, his grandfather, and with Horemheb. So even with that one treaty mode, we still don't know who broke the peace. But somebody had, and the ensuing conflagration had burned hot. Until now. These three provisions, peace and brotherhood, territorial integrity, and renewing previous treaties, set the scene and the tone. But the agreements were not solely devoted to peace. There were other concerns that both kings would address. The next pact was strategic. Hattusili and Ramesses had agreed to a brotherhood and to respect one another's territories. But what if an outsider threatened this new family bond? Well, the two brothers now agreed to a pact of mutual defense. The treaty says, quote, "If some enemy should come against the lands of either king, and he sends word to the other, saying, 'Come with me as ally against the enemy,' then that ruler will come forth and kill that enemy. But if the ally has no desire to go in person, then he must send his troops and chariots, and they will kill the foe. End quote. Hittite treaties often included these clauses. Presumably, Muwatalli II had invoked one from his vassals when he gathered his coalition to fight Ramesses at Kadesh. Now, Hattusili and Ramesses cast their brotherhood in bronze, so to speak, if they ever needed assistance against a foe, say the Cushites, the Babylonians, or the Assyrians. They would dispatch infantry and charioteers to form a mighty coalition. Such clauses are quite common in Hittite treaties. In fact, Muwatalli II had probably invoked this very agreement from his own vassals when he gathered his coalition to fight Ramesses at Kadesh. The question is, would this clause between Hattusili and Ramesses ever actually be invoked, or was it merely lip service? Only time would tell. Beyond the mutual defense against external foes, the treaty also provides security against rebellion. It is basically the same clause. If a vassal rebels or trespasses against either king, the other will come in person or dispatch soldiers to assist. In the big picture, this is more significant than it sounds. For one thing, it guarantees that earlier clause of respecting each other's territory. After all, if either Hattusili or Ramesses was going to get involved in a rebellion, it would probably happen in the borderlands around Syria and Canaan. For example, two of Hatti's vassals were Kadesh and Amaru, both of which had checkered histories of loyalty. Likewise, Ramesses II had recently dealt with, or at least claimed to deal with, rebellion in northern Canaan. So technically, this clause guaranteed, even if their vassals were disloyal again, the two great kings would maintain the other's authority. There would be no back and forth in the borderlands. Now, we have a most important agreement, at least for Hattusili. In the next passage, we find a guarantee of succession for Hattusili's heirs. The treaty says, quote, "The son of Hattusili, king of Hatti, shall be made king in place of Hattusili after the many years of his life. And if someone in Hatti commits an offense against the heir, then Ramesses, beloved of Amun, must send troops and chariots to take revenge on them." End quote. This passage is quite noteworthy. Firstly, the phrasing varies slightly between the two versions. In the Hattusa copy, it is fairly straightforward. The king of Egypt promises to protect Hattusili's heir against any uprising. At Karnak, though, it's a bit more elaborate. This version adds a note that when Hattusili dies and his heir becomes the king, then Ramesses should, quote, "be silent with his mouth forever." In other words, Ramesses also promised not to support any contender against Hattusili's heir. Historically, there is a clear logic to this agreement. You see, Hattusili was not legally the rightful king of Hatti. When his brother Muwatalli had died, the throne had gone to his son, a prince named Urhi-Teshub. As the uncle of this new ruler, Hattusili had served in the court for several years, but then he had rebelled. Hattusili had overthrown Urhi-Teshub, the rightful monarch, and seized power. Now, just a few years after that, Hattusili's rule was based more on strength rather than true legitimacy. What's more, that nephew, Urhi-Teshub, was still alive. He had fled Hatti into lands unknown, and there was every chance he might attempt a return. That's a whole thing that we can explore another time, but to make a long story short, it is easy to see why Hattusili included this succession clause. He wasn't secure in power just yet, and should he die unexpectedly, there was every chance that Urhi-Teshub or some other leader might rise up and make a bid for power. If that happened, there was a strong chance the rebel would appeal to other rulers, like Ramesses II, for military support. So this clause guaranteed the future of Hattusili's line. Ramesses promised to recognize the king's chosen heir, and he also promised not to intervene. Two sides of the same concern, but they give us a glimpse of Hattusili's anxiety. The other reason that this clause is so interesting is that it only applies to the Hittite succession. There is no equal guarantee for Hatti to intervene in Ramesses' dynastic legacy. There are two reasons why that might be. Firstly, compared to Hattusili, Ramesses was far more secure in power. True, his family was new to the thrones of Egypt, and that influenced some of his domestic policies, more on that in the future. But the king himself was well established. His father had promoted him to power visibly, and Ramesses was now 2 decades into his rule. What's more, the future looked promising in terms of dynastic stability. Pharaoh's family was growing rapidly. He had many sons and many daughters, and the odds of another group challenging one of them was probably quite remote. Finally, there may be a philosophical or religious reason why the succession clause only applied to Hatti. For the Egyptians, the succession of the throne was not something to be negotiated. At least conceptually, the Egyptian kingship had existed forever. The lineage of Ra, established at the dawn of creation, had been bequeathed to his son Shu, then to Geb, then to Osir, then to Horus, and now it incarnated in the person of the living monarch. Obviously, there might be breaks in the family line, even civil wars at certain periods, but certainly no foreigner should influence that succession. Definitely not a Hittite. Did anyone want a repeat of the Dakamunzu situation, the affair of the Egyptian queen seeking a Hittite prince? Probably not. From that perspective, it would actually be worse if that clause had been reciprocal. And at the end of the day, this promise cost Ramesses almost nothing, and it probably benefited him in terms of prestige. By making this agreement in writing, the king of Hatti publicly admitted that his kingdom was fragile and required Egyptian support. From that perspective, Ramesses was like the guarantor or protector of the Hittite lineage. The king of Egypt, of course, required no such aid, and he certainly would not ask for them. Moving on, we have one last major clause. It concerns fugitives. The two kings promised one another that if anyone should flee their kingdom and go to the other land, then that ruler would return said fugitive to their rightful master. Here, the two versions are basically identical. They say, quote, "If a great man or noble, or a town of people belonging to the lands of either ruler, comes to the land of the other king, then he shall not receive them. He shall have them returned to their master. Likewise, if a man who is unknown, like a commoner, flees from the land of either king, they shall not be left in that other land. They shall be seized and brought back." End quote. Again, this is a common clause in Hittite treaties generally. Presumably, it was fairly common for high-ranking courtiers, or ordinary folks, to abandon their existing position and flee to another land. This one might also cover vassal territories, who technically belonged to their overlord, so the fugitive aspect could double down on the earlier defense pacts. Either way, as far as the kings were concerned, such flights were a rebellion. So to protect their dignity and prestige, not to mention discouraging any others, fugitives must be returned. The treaty also makes a curious stipulation. In the next section, both parties promise that when recovering a fugitive, they will not exact punishment on the runaway. The treaty says, quote, "If a man flees from the land of Egypt, or Hatti, and comes to the other land, the great king must seize them and return them to his brother. But they shall not punish the fugitive for their offences. Let not their house, their wives, or their children be destroyed. let him not be killed. Let not his eyes, ears, mouth, or feet be harmed. Let no crime be held against him." End quote. This is kind of a dark clause in terms of what it reveals. In previous chapters, we have seen how difficult life could be under the Egyptian rule. At Amana, for instance, there is evidence of brutal punishments like impalement, episode 129. More recently, the decree of Horemheb punished crimes with disfigurement, cutting the nose, and exile to border fortresses, episode 171. Here, we get a promise of clemency, but the fact the treaty has to be so specific about "you will not punish them in this way or that is kind of dark. Whether this agreement was actually upheld, we can only guess. The treaty does not make any allowance for enforcement. Presumably, it relied on each king's honesty and their concern for reputation. Hopefully, it held up. The treaty ends with a series of religious components. First, we hear about the gods and goddesses who acted as witnesses for the agreement. I won't read all of them, but a partial list included, quote, "the 1,000 gods, male and female, belonging to the land of Hatti, and the 1,000 gods, male and female, of the land of Egypt, the sun god, lord of the sky, the storm god of Hatti, the god of Zippalanda, of Aleppo, the goddess of Nineveh, the gods who are lords of the oath, the god Amun, Para, or just Ra, Sutekh, the gods of the sky, earth, the great sea, the winds, and the clouds." End quote. Like a modern treaty or testimonial today, the treaty was confirmed by divine witness and oversight, and the two parties were bound by brotherhood and supernatural force. Doubling down on that, the treaty's final section includes a set of consequences. It mentions blessings for those who upheld the agreement, and curses for those who did not. The clause is simple, quote, "Whoever does not keep these agreements, the 1,000 gods of Hatti and the 1,000 gods of Egypt, will destroy his house, his lands, and his servants. Whoever shall keep these terms, the 1,000 gods of both lands, shall cause him to flourish and to live, together with his household, his land, and his servants." End quote. So, as long as Ramesses and Hattusili both upheld their agreement, each kingdom would flourish. If not, well. The treaty concludes with those blessings, curses, and the divine witnesses, and that brings us to the end of the text itself. What happened next? After the break, we'll explore the aftermath of the treaty's agreement. We'll see the correspondence between the two kings, which included an unusual offer, and we'll consider the treaty in the big picture. What did each party gain from this agreement? And would the peace endure? That is after the break. See you in a moment. In year 21, Ramesses II formalized his agreement with Hattusili III. Its agreements laid out in full, carved on tablets of silver, and the two kings formally acknowledged every provision. So, in the big picture, apart from the peace, what was everyone getting out of this treaty? For Hattusili, the benefits were twofold. First, the king of Hatti gained legitimacy. He achieved recognition as a great king rather than a usurper, and he got this acknowledgement directly from the king of Egypt. Diplomatically, that was worth its weight in gold. We can only guess how far this prestige extended domestically, but at the very least, the treaty and acknowledgement by Ramesses gave Hattusili a great boost in status. That recognition also gave security for his heirs. As a usurper, the king of Hatti probably had many concerns about the future and stability of his kingdom. After all, his brother Muwatalli had been a great king. Look what had happened to his lineage. The promise given by Ramesses to both acknowledge Hattusili's heir and to not intervene in the succession, that may have been a great balm to the king of Hatti's concerns. Secondly, the peace itself probably had some major benefits in the strategic sense, especially in Syria. The mutual promises not to attack each other's territories and to reject any rebels or fugitives meant that Hatti and Egypt no longer needed to guard their border zones quite so strongly. Hattusili, for instance, could worry less about Amuru, Kadesh, and whether the Egyptians might raid into Syria. With that in mind, the king of Hatti could perhaps move troops to other areas where security was lacking. This may have been quite beneficial, especially to the east. Around the time that Hattusili overthrew his nephew, and while Ramesses was rampaging around the Syrian heartlands, another power was threatening Hittite borders. This was the kingdom of Ashur, or Assyria, an old land east of the Tigris River that had seen better days in centuries past. Now, though, a new generation of Assyrian monarchs were expanding their power, and they were directly challenging Hatti in the floodplains of what is now northern Iraq. Recently, the Assyrians had actually defeated the Hittites in battle, or at least they claimed to, and they had swallowed up one of Hatti's vassals, the small kingdom of Hani-Galbat. That's a story for another chapter, but in short, the Hittites were dealing with a difficult situation in Syria and Mesopotamia. Even if things were not catastrophic, an end to the conflict with Egypt might at least free up resources, give them breathing space and an opportunity to reallocate troops. To be clear, there is no mention of Ashur itself in the treaty. Even with those mutual defense clauses, there is no suggestion that Hattusili wanted Ramesses to attack the Assyrians, or that Ramesses had any concern about the Assyrians attacking him. At best, it was more of a background issue, something to worry about, but not addressed in the treaty itself. So, Hattusili got legitimacy, for himself as a great king, and for his family when he died. He also got security in Syria, and the prestige of calling Egypt's pharaoh his brother. What about Ramesses? For the pharaoh, the treaty's impact is slightly more abstract. There was the immediate benefit of peace and quiet on the northern borders. However, Ramesses did have to give up his raids of Syria, and he could no longer legitimately press a claim on Amuru or Kadesh. It's hard to tell just how vital that was. For one thing, Ramesses had spent several years rampaging and raiding in Syria, but by year 21, those campaigns had started to slow down, perhaps even stop. The king of Egypt was now in his early 40s at least. He might carry on, leading one raid after another, but the benefits of that were never guaranteed. Perhaps, in the end, the Egyptians decided to hold what they had, rather than keep pushing north. That is speculative. Certainly, the end to the war, and the guarantees against rebellion or interference, would help secure the Canaanite territories. It's just hard to gauge how much they cared about Syria. At home, the peace treaty probably brought some prestige to Ramesses himself. For one thing, the king did edit these texts when he immortalized them on temple walls. At Karnak, for instance, the treaty includes a prologue where Ramesses describes the Hittites coming to him in order to, quote, request peace from the person of the pharaoh. So Ramesses presented the treaty to his audience, human and divine, as an act of submission from the wretched enemy. Similarly, the Karnak version makes a subtle distinction between the status of Ramesses and Hattusili. Throughout that text, you will find the Egyptian king described as the Hekka Aya, or great ruler. The Hittite, by contrast, is always called the Wer Aya, or great chief, rather than king. So at home in Egypt, the pharaoh downgraded his brother to a slightly lower status. He did not do that in the diplomatic correspondence. Whenever they wrote letters, Ramesses, or his scribes, always gave Hattusili his proper titles. But in the monumental record, in the Nile Valley, the king of Egypt played to his audience and shaped the message accordingly. So, Ramesses got security in Canaan, prestige at home, and a general sense of being superior to his northern rival. The Egyptian-Hittite Treaty, formalized in year 21, was bold in its proposals, brotherhood and unity, but surprisingly abstract on details, borderlines, territories, and so forth. Compared to modern treaties, the agreement is more personal, a gentleman's agreement kind of thing. It is less Treaty of Versailles and more like the Peace for Our Time declaration. For Ramesses and Hattusili, it marked a major shift in their relationship. The two rivals were now rivals no longer. They were uniting as family. The only question was, would the peace hold? Yes. I won't drag that out. The year 21 agreement did mark an end to warfare between the two empires. As far as the surviving records go, the Egyptians no longer raided Syria. The Hittites no longer pressured Canaan. The borders, however defined, held for the rest of Hattusili's reign, the rest of Ramesses' long life, and beyond. And the peace extended surprisingly far into the realm of cooperation and assistance. Henceforth, the two monarchs and their families would correspond with one another directly. They would send gifts, discuss relationships, and, of course, squabble about petty grievances or disputes. They would also engage in what we might call foreign aid. When the Hittites suffered a drought and there was famine in their land, Ramesses actually sent grain to Hatti and helped ease their burdens. Finally, while Ramesses and Hattusili had declared that they were family in a political sense, it wasn't long before they made that literal. Just over a decade after the treaty, Hattusili would send one of his daughters to Egypt to marry Ramesses himself. The negotiations for that marriage were long and frequently frustrating for both parties, but eventually they achieved it. The princess came to the Nile Valley, became a queen, and eventually produced children. Thus, the two houses of Ramesses and Hattusili eventually became one, cementing the agreement they had made in this treaty. It truly was a peace for their time. The History of Egypt podcast is supported by you, the listeners. I want to thank everyone who listens to the show, who shares it with a friend or reviews it on their podcasting app, and I would especially like to thank my supporters on Patreon. These fine folks brave the current economic tempest and provide foreign aid to my household. It is a most generous gift from wonderful people. I would like to give a special shout out to the priests, who are ridiculously generous with their money, and I am in their debt. My thanks to Jean, Andy and Chelsea, James B., Yola, TJ, Daniel, Jeffrey, Veronica, Mycost, Karen, C. Yen, Eric, Nidin, Dan, James M., Chris, Terry, Kate, Setnacht, Suyon, Carlos, Erjan, and Linda. Folks, you are all too kind. May the 1,000 gods and goddesses of the land of Hatti and the 1,000 gods and goddesses of the land of Egypt bless you for your ongoing support, and may they bring curses on anyone who would break covenant with you. To everyone listening, thank you so much for joining me. I'll see you soon.